I'm going to offer to you a few different gestures you can do, some stretching and some stability and some releasing for your lower body that helps with restriction in your hips. So when your hips get really tight and really stuck, and also how that tightness in your hips, both or one of them, can sometimes create like a pelvic rotation where the pelvis rotates off its axis. And sometimes that tightness in the hips can also bring the tension or the relationship. Tightness in the hip socket here, that's this socket here, can sometimes create tension through muscles in your lower leg, affecting how the knee is and the ankle. So what I like to think of when the hips sometimes get tight, it's because the muscles around the hip socket in this area get really tight and short, and they like draw the hip socket like a suction up into its acetabulum, which is the socket itself. And that can also then create torsion or twisting through the pelvis. So when the pelvis twists off its axis, it's usually from muscles that are tight that sit on a diagonal. So those muscles often are the psoas that sits in front of the pelvis here, and it sits from the axis and actually attaches down onto the leg. Another diagonal muscle on the back of the bone that acts as like a sandwich with the psoas here, is the QL, Quadratus Lumborum. So that can often cause a rotation in the pelvis or even a shift in the pelvis. So we're going to work with some ways to release that for you today. Another diagonal muscle that can sometimes be culprit is the piriformis muscle. So it's a muscle in the glute area in the buttocks, and it attaches here from the front surface of the sacrum across to the back and attaches onto the side of the hip itself. So hip joint, but this area, the greater trochanter out there, also has a lot of muscles that attach that can create restriction in the hip socket. So let's have a look. It's the three issues are often relating to a lack of mobility in the hip. So we're going to create some movement in the hip by mobilizing the area. It's sometimes related to stability in the pelvis. So we're going to have a look at that as well. And we can also work into what it's actually related to. So sometimes it's related to your lifestyle. Sometimes it's related to the bioenergetics. So it's more so from a quality of those subtle types of choices, or what drives the choices and the decisions in our lives. So very much the hips are related to how we adapt to life, how we adapt to changes, and influencing us to create a little bit more fluidity with our adaptability and being more flexible in our lives. It's also an area of the body that is really well supported from creative expressions in our life. So sometimes when life gets really fixated, it gets really tunnel vision, where we've got a little bit of goal orientation and our vision is really focused towards getting somewhere. Sometimes that rigidity in our mind can create tension and rigidity around the hips. So creative expression is really powerful. Doing anything really spontaneous, anything that's outside of the box. So just having a little bit more play and a little bit more fun in your life. So the first thing that we're going to have a look at, absolutely for you at home, have a look at those things we just spoke about, and also for the physical presentations, sense into these few simple gestures. So the first gesture is we set up in a cat-cow with our shoulders above our wrists and our hips above our knees, and have a nice strong core. So have the crown and tail moving in opposite directions. And we're going to start to bring our weight onto the the two hands and onto the left side for me here. The toes tucked gives you a little bit more stability. And we're going to just think about that knee making really big circles. So when I'm creating these circles, this is actually creating mobility through the hip. You can do that in each direction. You can do it with a long leg. So lots of different variations there. We can also look at some stability, which we'll look at a little bit later. If you bring the toes behind you now and over to the other side of the body, this will then open up through the QL muscle. So we've just mobilized the hip and then we stretch and lengthen the QL, that muscle that can cause some tightness through the pelvis. So if you bring the toes over to one side and then press the heel away from you, press through this hand now, the same long leg, and then look over your shoulder. It'll start to open up through the QL. You could create some little circles there to encourage that adaptability, or maybe that little bit of creative expression. Another great way to work through the hips, releasing the hips, is these adductors here that sometimes get tight. If you feel like your hamstrings might be a little bit tight, then it's really good to place a pillow underneath your hips. You can also keep the knees bent, and you can do this one-legged as well. So the few keys here, we might just play with the one-legged here, is I'm stretching through this area. I can stretch through this area simply by leaning forward, keeping the crown really long and just starting to pulse through my body, which will then help to lengthen this area. Double legs is also an option. And if you want to, while you're in this position, revisit the QL, we're stretching through the front area here. We can also stretch through the side body. And then the great one that I love that's really effective is actually releasing the glutes, which is all in the back of your hips here. Releasing the glutes, you can use one of these spiky balls here. You can also use a tennis ball, maybe even a golf ball. It's really good to start with that knee bent, and you can just start to, as you roll away from the ball, you can roll onto the ball just by leaning. It can be pretty tender, so sometimes it's just like, oh, just say a little hello first, and then you can roll all the way onto it. The options here are just to pause and let the tissue melt around the ball. The other option is just to roll around on it a little bit. So lots of different variations that you can have a play with at home. Great. Hope you enjoy, and see you next time.